Hello, welcome to the Sankofa Pan-African series. Today, we'll be celebrating the life of Phillis Wheatley, a poet, another African legend. Now, the girl who became immortalized through her poetry as Phillis Wheatley was captured around the area that constitute modern-day Senegal and the Gambia in 1776. She was kidnapped and transported to Boston in the US, where she was put up for sale and bought by a tailor who then gave her as a present to his wife. Although she is believed to have been about 8 years old when she was captured, the name that she was given by her parents at birth is lost to us forever because, like other captured people, she was not allowed to retain her given name. Instead, she was given the name of the ship on which she was transported, like cargo, into slavery. The name of the ship was the Phillis. She got the surname Wheatley from the family which bought her. Again, this was the tradition. Slaves were given the surnames of the families which owned them. Her autobiographer, Margareta Matilde Odell, who is responsible for most of what we know about Phillis Wheatley today, would like us to believe that when she was captured, she arrived in America without any knowledge of her past. Now, this is something that we should all question. Look around you and observe children of age 8 or even 7 and 6. Are they so completely unaware of their surroundings that if taken from where they are today to somewhere else, they would not remember any of their present life? I believe that as an 8-year-old child, the girl who was captured from Africa was old enough to have imbibed some of the cultures and the traditions of the area in which she was born and raised. I'll return to that later. Now, the Encyclopedia Britannica reports that the Wheatley family, who bought and then therefore owned the captive girl, quickly recognized her talent after she was bought. She was kept as a house slave and given privileges that were normally denied other slaves. Margareta Odell reports that the Wheatley family allowed their daughter to teach the young Phillis how to read and write. However, the young girl was so quick to learn that within 2 years, she had mastered the English language and had started learning Greek and Latin. She mastered these languages at an incredible rate and started translating Greek and Latin classics like Ovid. This is something that people actually earn university degrees in order to be able to do. Anyway, by the time she was a teenager, she was writing her own poetry, which the Wheatleys helped her send for publication. Like I said earlier, Margareta Odell, who is the source of most of what is known about Phillis Wheatley's early life, believed that she was a blank slate when she got to the US. And here is a quote from what she wrote about Phillis Wheatley. She writes, and I quote, "She does not seem to have preserved any remembrance of the place of her nativity or of her parents, excepting the simple circumstance that her mother poured water before the sun at his rising, in reference, no doubt, to an ancient African custom. Now, as incongruous as the idea that Phillis Wheatley did not preserve any remembrance of her early life before her captivity sounds, a lot of scholars actually believe this biographer. While it is possible to argue that as a child of 8, her memories might have become fragmentary after a while and might not have completely reflected the level of sophistication of the cultural context that shaped them. My position is that as a prodigy, which Phillis Wheatley was unquestionably one, her propensity for such a level of sophistication must be taken into consideration. The fact that she was a prodigy is reflected in the way in which she quickly learned everything. And it is apparent that she was not just, an ordinary girl. She was an uncommonly brilliant girl. So that was why she was able to learn not just English, but Greek and Latin. So how could she have landed in the US without having learned anything from the context from within the oral culture in which she was raised? How could she have lived 8 years of her life having a brilliant mind as she did without assimilating any of the cultural forms or models that surrounded her? And as researchers into oral tradition and oral cultures over time have come to accept, assimilation of cultural forms and models occurs at a much more rapid rate in predominantly oral cultures. Odell's claim that Phillis Wheatley did not remember anything about her life before being brought to America, we then led people to believe that she was only able to write poetry because she was influenced by neoclassical Western poetry, should be contested, because the same biographer actually contradicts herself. Now, in one breath, the biographer writes that she does not seem to have preserved any remembrance of the place of her nativity or of her parents. In the next breath, she writes that, accepting the simple circumstance that her mother poured out water before the sun at his rising, in reference, no doubt, to an ancient African custom. Now, my question is, if she did not retain any memory from her childhood, how could she have recalled her mother pouring libation to the sun? In addition, if you study Phillis Wheatley's poems, not only will you find that the sun plays a prominent role in them, but in another poem which is titled To the Right Honorable Williams, Earl of Dartmouth, it is apparent that she did not forget all about her life before her enslavement. This poem actually illustrates that Phillis Wheatley retained some vivid memories of her past life in Africa. She does not only recall her parents, but there are hints about how she was abducted. And I'll take a quote from that as well. I, young in life, by seeming cruel fate, was snatched from Afric's fancied happy seat. What pangs excruciating must molest, what sorrows labor in my parents' breasts. Stilled was that soul and by no misery moved, that from a father seized his babe beloved. Such my case. And can I then but pray others may never feel tyrannic sway? End of quote. The result of the assumption that Phillis Wheatley had no recollection of her life before enslavement is such that people who have appraised her works have not even tried to identify the influences of her early life in Africa on her poems. Yet, we know that she was taken captive from the area around modern-day Senegal and Gambia, which has a rich history of oral culture through the jelly, also called griots in French. And these jelly or griots are people who are from ancient times, have produced celebrated oral poets, lyricists, and historians. The very fact that Phillis Wheatley started writing poetry a few short years after arriving in the US should really not surprise any serious academic. It is not far-fetched at all to say that she was influenced by the rich traditions of her native land. On the other hand, she did not appear to know any female poets in America, even though there were some female poets writing in Britain and a few, in the US, whose works might have influenced her. There's nothing in her biography to actually convince us that she met any of these writers. So if we're to, and again, if we're to go by the women writers, even today, a lot of them actually admit that their mothers and community mothers who were versed in oral traditions influenced their ability to see themselves as creators of stories and poems. So is it so remote to then assume that Phillis Wheatley knew women who were jelly or griots in her native land? Or that she might have come from a family of verbal artists? In pre-colonial Africa, just as in present times, there were women who served as oral artists. Oral history, poetry, storytelling, and other spoken art forms are all ways of cultural expressions found in most parts of Africa. This rich history of oral traditions is not unique to the Senegambia area at all. In most parts of Africa, traditional rulers and other aristocrats engaged artists who practiced highly developed and diverse art forms. However, principal among these art forms was the oral narration of societal, lineage, and personal history, which were performed in the most poetic language. For instance, every Yoruba ruler had a poet laureate, and in the same way, not only the aristocrats or the wealthy, but every Yoruba family had members who were well versed in their oriki. In the areas of modern-day Senegal and the Gambia, from which Phillis Wheatley was abducted, these oral artists are still famous today. As custodians of history, some of their detailed oral histories cover the span of thousands of years. It is through the oral arts of the jelly that the names of and feats of great kings and warriors like Sundiata Keita, Kelefa Sane, Buri Ndiaye, Omar Tall, and several others are known to us today. It is all through songs and the oral traditions passed from one generation to the other that we know about the great feats achieved by these people. Anyway, back to Phillis Wheatley. Phillis Wheatley's life. As the first black person to publish a book of poetry in America, and possibly anywhere in the world, she generated a lot of attention. How unfortunately, the significance, of her role and struggles as a pioneer of African American literature, or even African literature generally. And by literature now, I'm talking strictly about written, works. So she was a pioneer in that field. She was probably the first black person to publish a collection of poems of any work of any literary stature. Anyway, an inquisition was actually set up before her book was allowed to be released. The inquisition was set up because the Western world was convinced of the intellectual inferiority of the black race. According to Henry Louis Gates Jr., in a book titled The Trials of Phillis Wheatley, a panel was assembled to verify the authorship of her poems and to answer an even larger question, which was a Negro actually capable of producing literature? Even way before that inquisition, notable Western philosophers and thinkers like Francis Bacon, René Descartes, David Hume, Immanuel Kant, and George Frederick Hegel had speculated on the humanity of Africans and concluded that Negroes were intellectually inferior to white people. So, as the first person to write a book that was approved for publication by an audience so skeptical of the capacity of her race, Phillis Wheatley was challenged not only to prove her intellectual capacity, but also that of her entire race. Imagine the weight of a whole race on the shoulders of this young woman. And boy, did she bear it with pride. The immediate response to the publications of Wheatley's first book was twofold. People like Voltaire became actually convinced, of the ability of black people to create art for the first time. And because of this change in their belief about black people, even the anti-slavery writers now started citing her as proof positive of the equality of Africans and a reason for the abolition of slavery. So this woman's writing was instrumental, in the abolition of slavery, because she was proof that the black people were intellectual equals to the whites who enslaved them. However, there were others who refused to change their views. And an example of them, believe it or not, was Thomas Jefferson. Yes, the same celebrated president, Thomas Jefferson, who, rather than concede the equality of Africans, shifted the goalposts, moved the argument away from the question of whether or not Phillis Wheatley was, as a black person, had a soul and therefore the ability to write. Instead, he now decided to focus on examining and rubbishing the quality of her work. When Jefferson was finally forced to concede that Africans had souls, he continued to maintain their inferiority. As such, he found it necessary to dismiss her writing by asserting that her poems were below the dignity of criticism. This same Jefferson, over several years, raped his late wife's half-sister and fathered several children by her. The evil of slavery made it acceptable for Sally Hemings to be given as a slave to Jefferson's wife, even though they had the same father. And after the death of the wife, for Jefferson to molest this teenage girl, when he started fathering children with her and ended up fathering, many children with her and still holding her in servitude. Anyway, in spite of all the obstacles in Phillis Wheatley's way, she persevered in her writing. She died in Boston, Massachusetts on the 5th of December, 1784. Some of her poems include To Maecenas, On Virtue, On Being Brought from Africa to America, Goliath and Gath, Niobe in Distress for Her Children Slain by Apollo, from Ovid's Metamorphoses, An Answer to the Rebus, and so many more. Please look out for the complete writings of Phillis Wheatley. Her complete works are published in one collection titled The Complete Writings of Phillis Wheatley. Thank you once again for being a part of this. See you next time. Please subscribe if you have not done so, like us, and share this video with your contacts. Thank you.